Shea Wingate joins us today in Bereave Studios. Shea is a licensed mental health therapist, easy for me to say, and grief coach. Also known as the Grief Girly on social, Shea helps people navigate the trickiest days of their journey and build a meaningful life after loss. Shea, welcome to Bereave Studios.
Yeah, Justin, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you again. The goal of this podcast, Shea, for you and anybody else who's new, is to build community through shared experiences. So today, this is the story of your journey. Thanks again for being here. Can you talk a little bit about what led you to this work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to be a therapist, went to school to be a therapist, and in my training found grief work to be something that I was drawn to, and didn't really make like a ton of sense in terms of like I didn't have a bunch of losses in my life, but I just found grief work to be really meaningful. And I like to say the universe said, "Oh, you're interested in grief work. Well, here's some grief work. Here's some grief to work on." So anyway, I graduated, got my degree, was working as a therapist, and of course, grief came up in therapy. But it was something that I really enjoyed. And then, like I said, I got my own life lesson in grief. So I can go into that if you want me to tell more about my story. But basically, after my own grief and navigating my own loss, I realized that there wasn't a lot of people out there interested in doing grief as a therapist. So I kind of saw the need, and it was something that I was interested in. I had my own lived experiences. So I really thought it would be meaningful to take the school side of things, what it feels like in your body, the lived experience of grief side of things, and bring that together to support people.
Totally. Yeah. So you were already going down this path,
yeah,
and had life experiences, which, enhanced your ability to kind of put the learning plus the experience together and really show up for people in probably a much different way than people that had not had that second part of the equation. Do you feel like that's been the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that grief is unique, and that grievers really do appreciate a therapist, a coach, anyone supporting them who has understanding. Because it's one thing to learn about it in school and learn tools and learn theories, but it really is a different lived experience.
Sure. I'm curious, what changed between the grief work that you were doing before your own experiences to after?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So I really understood differently about, like I said, how it felt in your body, how grief changed you as a person. You have to also like grieve yourself, how it changes and shows up in all of your relationships because you're different now, how long it really lasts, like just really so much change about my understanding. Not that I necessarily will understand someone's pain, that's specific to them.
Sure.
But I really can help them understand things they might not have realized, like you're also grieving yourself, or you're going to show up differently in your relationships, or it's not just 1 year that's hard when you're grieving.
Sure.
It's longer than that, unfortunately.
Right. Do people, whether they are grievers or non-grievers, do they typically show up thinking about just a year?
Yeah, well, I think really people hear that, like the first year is the hardest, is something that people hear. And really, the first year is survival. And then grievers feel like sometimes a lot of shame that they made it through the first year, and then they're having more trouble because they think that they're supposed to be over it. And so they feel really surprised by that. But really, the first year is like a lot of survival, and you're in a fog, which is protective. It's so much to handle with a loss that you're kind of like numbed out to some of it. So then when that fog starts to lift, and then you're like, oh, now is when I need like some tools and support and understanding. That's when a lot of people come to me, because they're like, oh, it's been a year. I should be feeling better. Or I have this idea that I should be feeling better, and I'm not. And they realize that they need some tools.
That's so interesting. I've got a handful of questions here, but I'm curious. I hear the word fog a lot. I have not been in one of those fogs to this point in my life. I'm sure I will someday. Can you give a little bit of description of like what it means? Like I'm making a lot of assumptions, I think, about what that means, but uh, maybe your fog experiences or the fog experiences that you hear of other the ways they describe that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can talk about my experience. And this is something that even now it's like hard for me to remember some of the early days of my grief. And
Mhm,
I sort of can remember them, but it also is like I didn't really live that. It's almost like I was checked out, going through the motions. I
mhm,
do kind of remember this one story because it was sort of a joke that I would say like, "What do you mean I'm stressed?" to people in my life, and they would be like,
mhm,
I was saying, "What do you mean the sky is blue?" But I had no idea I was stressed.
mhm,
I was so
mhm,
disconnected from myself. So for me, the fog was like sort of disconnected, out of touch, hard to remember things. Um, yeah, and that lasted for a long time.
wow. The word disconnected and the words disconnected and out of touch, uh, those stick with me. Those are great descriptors. Um, you said something about the fog being protective. Is that sort of kind of a natural reaction in humans that your body goes into this survival mode, and that is there to almost protect you in some ways? Is that how that kind of unfolds?
Yeah, absolutely. Grief, especially like a sudden loss, can be a trauma,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, it's absolutely protective. But you have to remember, there's all different kinds of loss. So, like, my dad and sister died suddenly. My dad died. I was there. I watched him die. It was horrible. My sister died, and I wasn't there. So that's even though they're both sudden deaths, those are very different experiences. My mom was
Sure.
sick with cancer and dying for a year, and then I was there with her when she was on hospice dying. So all of those experiences are so different. So
Mm-hmm.
the way that I'm going to like respond to them is so different. So I like to say to
Mm-hmm.
people, your outcome on your grief is based on a lot of things, like who died, how did they die, how did you know about their death, how did you learn about it, what was your relationship like with them, where are you at in your life. All of these things impact
Mm-hmm.
what kind of grief you're going to have. So
Mm-hmm.
just take a really like, well, I'll take my example. Like my mom sick and dying, I was grieving her from the point of diagnosis. I was saying goodbye the
Sure.
whole time. I got to be proactive in her care. My dad and my sister, it was sudden, it was a shock. I didn't get to be proactive in helping them. That impacts you differently than
Mm-hmm.
someone who you get to be hands-on with them.
Yeah. That's such a great way to kind of talk about that in terms of different variables producing different feelings. Um, uh, First of all, I don't want to skirt over it. Very sorry for the loss of your family members. I read a little bit about your story, obviously, and couldn't imagine those, especially so close to as they were. So, very sorry to hear that. Um, when you're talking about the different variables and the different types of grief, um, do people that typically show up to in your world, whether they become patients or not, do people typically understand that all of those variables exist? And I'm asking mostly because I feel like my perception is that most, especially non-grievers, if you will, just think grief is grief.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
is that about how that unfolds in the world,
Mm-hmm.
or am I off
Mm-hmm.
there?
Yeah, they have no idea that that is. I mean, we talk about it, and for me, it's so obvious. It's like, how could somebody not know? But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, people don't really know, and I think that it's just so different after you've lived through loss
Mm-hmm.
that you really start to realize all these variables, and then you can understand that. But sometimes people in their world supporting them have no idea that there's different variables, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
they're putting their experience with loss onto the person who's in grief right now, and they're like, oh well,
Mm-hmm.
this is how it goes, but they don't realize that those variables are there. So if they had lost like a parent, and then their parent was like sick and dying and they were older, versus losing like a child suddenly. Like those are
Mm-hmm.
completely different. They're both valid. They're
Sure.
both grief, but the
Mm-hmm.
way that you show up in the grief and like these out of order deaths, it's like kind of
Mm-hmm.
a way to say things. Like it was
Mm-hmm.
unexpected, out of order for my 38-year-old sister to die, for my dad to
Mm-hmm.
die, for my mom to die. My mom and dad were in their early 60s. My dad was 61. My mom was 60 years old. Like that wasn't really expected. And so that
Mm-hmm.
variable makes it more complex.
Yeah, sure. Um, and you said something interesting about the supporters. They don't really seem to understand it, right? So if which is probably why I hear a lot about platitudes, and it's really easy to say the wrong thing, right? Guilty of saying the wrong thing plenty of times in my life, but that supporters understand it, and I feel like there's an opportunity to better inform or educate supporters, and unfortunately, that's just like trying to educate the general public, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any tools or resources for supporters that you know of, that as we do our work in tandem, we can start to get those things out into the world to help people have resources to be able to support our loved ones well?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you're supporting someone who's grieving, go online and read grief stories. It's easy, it's free, you can do it as quickly or as much as you want to. And you will undoubtedly see a lot of different variables and things coming up and how people deal with their loss. So that could be a way for supporters to, you were saying, resources that I don't know if there's like official, I'm sure there are official like resources,
Mm-hmm.
but that's what I would recommend to someone. And be curious towards your griever,
Mm-hmm.
asking questions like, what is this like for you? And then listening and sitting with the uncomfortable feeling of, it's not my job to fix this. I can't fix this. They're
Mm-hmm.
not asking me to fix this. But
Mm-hmm.
grievers, generally speaking, grievers like to talk about their grief. And if they don't, they'll
Mm-hmm.
let you know. But
Mm-hmm.
I would encourage the supporters to ask questions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, asking questions is such a it feels like such a simple thing to do, uh, but in that moment, and I've seen a few things that you've talked about in terms of supporters trying to fix things.
Yeah.
Um, I, I know it all comes from a good place and those types of things, but where do you think that comes from? Uh, why people just jump in and they say things, they make statements, they try to fix things instead of doing what sometimes they even do much more naturally, which is just be inquisitive to your friend.
Yeah, grief is uncomfortable for our society. We
Yeah.
don't grieve together anymore. We don't have these outward symbols or rituals or traditions in the same way. People don't know what to do. Traditions, symbols, rituals, they help us, and we don't have those.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it feels really awkward for people to just sit in like silence or not having an answer. But really, listening is doing something. You
Mm-hmm.
were helping, you were doing something, showing that you care, being curious is doing something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Listening is doing something.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
that's a really good way, at least for me, to kind of grasp on to the things that you're saying here. You talked a little bit about symbols and traditions that we don't have, or that we don't have anymore. Um, can you talk a little bit about some of the things that maybe we used to have and now we don't, which makes it a little bit more difficult?
Yeah, I mean, like people used to like have like the yellow ribbon for their door, like people would wear all
Sure.
black and be in mourning. So like just like
Mm-hmm.
something simple, like
Mm-hmm.
marking on your body or your home that this is what your family or you is going through. I used to say like, I wish I had a pin I could wear. Like, I'm grieving, be nice to me. Like I
Mm-hmm.
need
All
your
right.
compassion. And something that was really interesting was my mom was sick and cancer and going through chemotherapy. And so she had this like sign, like her head was shaven, her hair was falling out, like a sign, like, be gentle with this person. She's dealing with some stuff, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that it was really, she said it was like really nice for her that people could kind of see like what
Mm-hmm.
she was going through. And so I
Sure.
I think that would have been nice as a active early day griever to have that too. Like I look like I'm fine, but I'm not. And it's shocking to me that you can't tell that because I am like internally screaming, and I have to like help my clients
Right.
with that too. Like you look okay. I know you don't feel good, but you look okay. So people don't understand. You have to let them know. And of course, grievers like don't want to do that. It sucks that they have
Sure.
to, but you need to let people in your life know what's going on. They can't read your mind.
Sure. Yeah, that kind of leads me into you made a comment about in kind of preparation here about society thinking of grief as a private matter.
Mm-hmm.
That almost like we should do it alone.
Mm-hmm.
Yet you're talking about outward symbols, verbal and nonverbal symbols
Mm-hmm.
that can help maybe even the general public interact with the griever. I'm curious. As you know, you gave that example of your mom and her sign.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen anything? Have you seen any progression in some of these outward signs, or are we just purely going kind of backward on it?
Well, I think people do that now through kind of like posting online about what they're going
Mm,
through. And I really think that that's great when I have clients who are open about their grief online, if that's what they want to do and that feels safe for them and they
hmm
resonate with that. And I think that's like a way to sort of signal to your community, this is what's going on, or this is how I'm doing. If somebody wants to do that, I think that's probably a good way to do it these days. Oh, and I mean, old fashioned, just
Yeah,
talking to people, let them know
just talking to people.
what's going
So
on.
so old fashioned.
Yeah. Or you could post about it. But, I think it's important to let like the people in your life know, like your work, your close friends, your family, because like you're going to show up in these relationships and you're not yourself and
hmm
you're not ever going to be that person that you were before that
hmm
your loved one died. So it would be great to let the people in your life know how to support you, and they don't know what to do. And like, you
hmm
seem okay. You're not totally falling apart. So they're just going to try to like treat you like they're going to take a lead from you. And if you're not
hmm
saying anything, they're just going to act like, okay, I'll just pretend like we're not talking about it either. And then grievers can be really upset.
hmm and that I would assume, and I've heard kind of people kind of allude to, how that impacts relationships later, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've heard
Mm-hmm.
people say, well, hey, they never asked,
Yeah.
right? I needed a friend, and I know they are a good friend, but I didn't hear from them, and that was really difficult, and it can go on to impact relationships later. Um, Knowing that happens, do you in your work have to help people or get the opportunity to help people with some of that repair?
Hmm. That's a really good question. Yeah. Yeah. We do work with some repair, and it just depends on if the griever wants to do that. I mean,
Mm,
I'm encouraging them to do that if they like. This was a like an example that's coming to mind. This was like a childhood friend, and like we grew
mhm,
up together, and she knew my family, and then she knew that so and so died, and it's like, well, do you want to repair that relationship? And
mhm,
if you do, then let's talk about how to do that. But like okay, so this is the thing about grief. Like sometimes your brain will focus on anything but the grief, and then if I ask the people that question, do you want to repair that relationship, they're like, actually no, not really. We haven't really been friends in 10 years. They just lived down the street from me growing up. So it's this example of like
mm,
your brain is just trying to fix any other problem or latch onto anything else. Like for me, I kind of became like really, critical of like my job, my apartment, like just anything besides the
mhm,
grief. So that might be a sign of like, I'm just trying to think about anything besides my grief. But if it
right.
is like an important relationship that you need to repair, yeah, like absolutely, that could be
Mhm,
something that you
mhm,
can get support in doing that. And I think
mhm,
if it's an important relationship that you want to repair, it's worth that potentially awkward conversation. But if it's not, then it's like, okay, that might just be your brain trying to latch on to
mhm,
something. So
mhm.
let's take that as a cue that your grief needs some attention and deal with that.
That's awesome, and super helpful. At the end there, you said a sign that your grief needs attention.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And as you're talking, I'm thinking about having a support system that doesn't know what to say, and maybe people who have just kind of moved on. How do if I'm in the process of grieving and I know that I need, or I don't know that I need to do something, maybe I'm in that fog. How can people ultimately kind of raise their hand to get help? Because I would assume that it's on them, right? Nobody's showing up at their door. You're not showing up at anybody's door saying, "Hey, I heard you suffered loss. Can I help?" Right? How do people like get the strength or the encouragement or the resources? Like, how does it all unfold for somebody?
So, like, how would a griever realize their grief needed attention?
Right.
Yeah. So,
You said that much nicer, much more eloquently.
if something is really bothering you and you have all these emotions, it needs your attention. Emotions are information. That's a sign that something it needs attention. And if you're trying to actively like squash it, that's the sign it needs attention. So one of my clients said, like, he said, like, you talk about grief like it's a living thing, like you've got to befriend it and give it attention and it's knocking at your door. And I'm like, yeah, like it sort of is like that. And it's building this relationship with your grief to understand it and understand what it needs and understand what it's signaling to you, and then you can respond to it. And so that's a lot of the work that I do. And I think that people figure that stuff out when they're in a place then their life isn't going well because of grief, and they go and get help, and then they can figure out this kind of stuff like, oh, my grief needs attention, I have to start listening to it. It matters that I respond. But I think sometimes a lot of people come to me because they're like, I had this grief and then things did kind of fall apart, and so now I need some help figuring it out.
Yeah, totally. So what I hadn't thought through there is like when you're trying to suppress it,
Yeah,
right? Like
suppressing
that
grief.
that seems a major sign.
Yes, suppressing grief. Like, suppressing grief is like, have you ever held like a beach ball underwater? Like, those blow up ones that like you
Yeah,
toss
yeah.
around, like holding it underwater. It's supposed to float on top of the pool, but you want to like push it
Right.
down. You have to spend like a lot of energy pushing it down underwater. And if you don't give it your attention, it'll like slip up and like the ball will pop you in the face. The water will go everywhere. But you can't enjoy the pool party if you're pushing this ball underwater with both hands. It's not supposed to be down there. You have to really put a lot of effort in, and you're missing out on the party. That's kind of what it's like when you're suppressing or trying to avoid your grief. It's like you're spending all this energy pushing this thing down that's not supposed to be pushed down. It's going to eventually pop up, probably at the worst time when you're in a meeting at work, and you can't really like be in your life if you're always like afraid of it and like trying to battle it.
Yeah. You talked for a minute about somebody, one of your patients talking to you about basically personifying grief. And then you kind of came back and gave this really tangible example, right? I mean, there's one thing to name it or give it a name, and those types of things that are all going on in your head. It's all kind of this mental struggle. But you gave us really vivid, and it's vivid for me because I've done it. I've held that ball underneath the water, and I couldn't imagine being in a meeting, as the example you used, trying to push that ball down underwater.
Yeah, that resistance takes everything, and then things do kind of fall apart around you, and then you're like, oh, maybe I do need some help.
Wow. One of the things that you mentioned that I was inspired by is that you mentioned the capacity for growth and love and healing for your patients, that you end up seeing, which is great. You see clients who make a tremendous amount of progress through their journey with you, which is great. Can you talk a little bit about some of those, some of those feelings or moments when somebody realizes, hey, I'm taking steps, I'm making progress, even if it's small, just with some of those progressive steps might look like?
Yeah, so like grief work isn't about getting over, moving on, forgetting. It's not, at least with me, it's not about that at all. It's about growing around this loss. Like this is a part of your life, a part of you, a part of your story. It's not like we're trying to erase it, but at the beginning there's this like gaping hole, and then eventually we have to grow around it. You can think of it as like a tree that gets cut down, and then you kind of see like a little stem like growing out of the stump. Like you can see the stump. You saw that that tree was what it used to be. It was cut down, but there's like new life coming out of that despite this big chop that it got. So that's how I think about grief work. It's about growing around that loss. And, you know, people, if they choose to make meaning of their loss, they're definitely going to have better outcomes. And then people can really like realize things about themselves. Like, wow, I didn't realize I was a person who avoided emotions, or I didn't realize I was a person who didn't ask for what I need or let people walk all over me. And like, they can learn that through the grief work, because that kind of stuff that they struggle with is coming up in their grief. And then we're not just working on the grief, but we're also working on all of these like concerns that are getting in the way even more. Like, I don't ask anyone in my life for what I need. I don't know how to listen to myself or my emotions at all. I'm afraid of them. I run from them. That's going to come up during the grief work, and we have an opportunity to work on it. And then they can see this loss as like, oh, if they choose a way to be like, okay, that horrible thing happened, but like I chose to learn so much about myself.
Yeah. I love your tangible examples that help somebody like me understand, get a glimpse into the world with talking about the tree and the growth, talking about the beach ball underwater. Like those things are so tangible and so relatable to me, and I haven't heard a lot of those before. So you got to one person today, at least. So thank you for that. Shea, this has been awesome. Can you talk a little bit about where people can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm most active probably on Instagram, The Grief Girly. I also have TikTok, the same name, The Grief Girly. You can check out my website. But yeah, I think that if anyone's interested in like learning more, I'd be happy to like chat with them and let them know a little bit more about my work, what I do. And I would say investing in yourself is totally worth it. You don't have to navigate this alone. It's okay to get help. We sometimes think of grief as not like a mental health concern. It's something we should just figure out. It's a part of life. Everyone goes through this. I should just figure this out. Well, not necessarily. It can be more complex than that. And even if it is a part of life that everyone goes through, who cares? You need support. And why not reach out and see if it could be beneficial to you?
Totally. I love that. So obviously, the Grief Girly on Instagram, the Grief Girly on TikTok, all can get to your website through there. Are there any other just kind of public resources that you tend to maybe direct people to every now and then that might be beneficial for folks? And if the answer is no, that's okay too.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite websites is Julia Samuel's Grief Works. She has this amazing thing called like 8 Pillars of Strength on her website, and it's free. You can look at it, and she just sort of breaks down she calls it pillars of strength, some of the strengths that you can latch onto when you're going through a loss. That's something that I recommend that people check out. And I recommend to grievers and supporters, read stories of people's loss. It helps you as a griever to kind of feel normalized. And then you can see that there's like your own self in those stories, even though it's a different like circumstances, situation, you can still see like the grief and like feel a little less alone, a little more known. And then, like I said earlier, it might help supporters understand all these different variables that grievers deal with.
Totally. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. And just for anybody that's watching and you are looking for grief stories on YouTube, on the Bereaved Community channel, you can actually scroll a little bit and see people like Nate Spangle and Daniel Fuller and Bailey Shelter, friends of ours who have been very generous with their time talking about their loss and their grief journeys specifically. So you can find a few there. And as Shea alluded to, there's no shortage of places to find those things. So get out there and take a look. Shea, fantastic having you. Really, really appreciate your time, your generosity, your willingness to share, and look forward to talking with you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Justin. This was great.